Florida built its economy on the illusion of self-sufficiency, assuming it could decouple from traditional partners like Canada without consequence. Today, fractures in tourism, investment, and migration flows reveal that this assumption was strategically flawed. Mobility restrictions, shifting travel patterns, and policy recalibrations are converging to expose Florida's over-reliance on a single geopolitical bet. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you re-seeing on the ground, so you stay a step ahead. The first trend is clear. Global borders are tightening, and mobility is no longer frictionless. The pandemic reshaped travel governance, embedding restrictions that were never fully rolled back. States and nations, once aligned through trade and tourism corridors, are recalibrating policies under domestic pressure. Florida, dependent on inbound Canadian flows for seasonal tourism and real estate stability, underestimated how geopolitical frictions could disrupt this artery. The resulting strain is not isolated. It reflects a global reality where regional hubs cannot insulate themselves from mobility shifts. Economic interdependence magnifies the problem. Canadian travelers historically injected billions into Florida's economy, from healthcare-linked seasonal stays to property acquisitions. With border frictions rising, that flow has contracted. In parallel, Canada itself is diversifying outbound destinations, steering citizens toward Europe and Latin America, eroding Florida's privileged position. This redirection is compounded by currency fluctuations, where a strong US dollar disincentivizes discretionary travel south. The cumulative effect is not cyclical, it is structural. Florida's assumption of autonomy in tourism and migration strategy disregarded the architecture of global flows. The state's political signaling, often hostile to external stakeholders, accelerated this erosion. When governments in Ottawa review visa exemptions, bilateral agreements, and cross-border healthcare reciprocity, the repercussions fall disproportionately on Florida. This is less about ideology and more about operational miscalculation. A failure to anticipate that mobility, once fractured, rarely returns to its prior baseline. What unfolds in Florida mirrors patterns observed worldwide. Countries from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe that once relied heavily on single-source markets are confronting the same exposure. For intelligence analysts, the key signal is the durability of these mobility disruptions. They are no longer anomalies, but embedded constraints, reshaping state economies at the subnational level. Florida is simply the most visible case study in North America. The lesson is strategic dependency. Over-reliance on one corridor or one nationality creates systemic risk. Florida's declining inflows from Canada reflect a broader recalibration where mobility is weaponized, restructured, and reprioritized. The state's miscalculation illustrates how local policy choices intersect with global travel governance, producing vulnerabilities that are only beginning to surface. Passports and visas have quietly become the battlefield of this transition. Where exemptions once smoothed mobility, silent collapses are now underway. Canada's outbound travelers face new digital authorizations, extended processing delays, and reciprocity challenges that alter traditional patterns. For Floridians dependent on this flow, the consequences emerge in lagging property sales, weakened tourism metrics, and declining seasonal labor exchanges. These are not isolated inconveniences, they are structural disruptions. Electronic travel authorizations, biometric screenings, and secondary reviews are no longer neutral. They serve as instruments of selectivity, where minor discrepancies can result in outright revocation. Florida's policymakers underestimated how these procedural filters, designed abroad, could choke off critical inflows. In intelligence terms, the choke point is administrative, not physical. Borders are closing quietly through paperwork, not walls. This shift also reflects a deliberate recalibration by Ottawa. In a global environment where trust is fragmented, Canada is privileging destinations aligned with its strategic priorities. Florida, increasingly portrayed as politically antagonistic, no longer occupies a position of preferential treatment. Visa regimes and travel advisories become subtle levers in this realignment, reshaping behavior without overt confrontation. For travelers, the cumulative effect is fatigue and deterrence. Canadians accustomed to seamless entry into Florida now faced unpredictability. This unpredictability reduces repeat travel, erodes trust in established patterns, and redirects demand toward markets that offer stability. Florida, by failing to anticipate this shift, finds itself exposed. The broader takeaway is that mobility frameworks, once predictable, are now fluid. Visa waivers can be suspended overnight. Entry authorizations can be recalibrated through algorithmic risk scoring. Florida's miscalculation is a preview of how local economies will suffer when over-reliance meets abrupt policy recalibration. Security and surveillance deepen the fracture. Artificial intelligence at borders is redefining how travelers are profiled. Digital footprints, financial data, and health records converge into risk scores that determine entry. For Canadian travelers to Florida, this introduces a layer of scrutiny that was previously absent. The friction is invisible but decisive. Profiling based on nationality, travel history, or political expression is no longer theoretical. Border systems now integrate cross-domain data, linking social media signals, financial irregularities, and healthcare records. For Florida, this means Canadian inflows, once routine, now face algorithmic barriers that cannot be negotiated. Mobility is increasingly dictated by opaque models, not human discretion. Surveillance regimes also produce spillover effects. Travelers aware of heightened monitoring recalibrate their choices, seeking destinations where privacy is less compromised. Europe and the Caribbean benefit from this recalibration, siphoning flows away from Florida. The state's lack of adaptation to surveillance-driven deterrence compounds the vulnerability. The integration of biometric and AI systems is uneven across jurisdictions, producing asymmetry. Florida's reliance on federal border protocols leaves it without agency to influence or mitigate these dynamics. In effect, the state is hostage to federal implementation of global surveillance norms, unable to carve exceptions for critical partners like Canada. The strategic consequence is a loss of predictability. Businesses that once forecast demand based on historical inflows now confront uncertainty. Tourism operators, property developers, and healthcare providers in Florida are recalibrating models under conditions of volatility. Surveillance-driven disruption is not temporary, it is systemic. Traveler perceptions reveal a deeper fracture. For Canadians, Florida was once synonymous with accessibility and familiarity. That perception is eroding. Our rising costs, unpredictable border procedures, and political hostility shift sentiment toward destinations perceived as welcoming. Trust, once built over decades, is dissolving rapidly. Americans experience the inverse when traveling abroad. U.S. passports, once among the most privileged, now face increased scrutiny in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Visa reciprocity, secondary screenings, and reputational challenges undermine the ease Americans once took for granted. Florida's Canadian exposure parallels broader reputational risks faced by U.S. citizens globally. Regional contrasts are sharp. Europeans diversify mobility toward intra-Schengen flows. Latin Americans recalibrate around regional blocs like Mercosur. Asians navigate tightening US and Australian visa regimes by redirecting toward regional hubs like Singapore. Against this backdrop, Florida's exposure to a single nationality appears strategically naive. For Canadians specifically, the cultural memory of Florida as a seasonal extension of home is fading. Younger generations prioritize destinations aligned with digital nomadism, flexible entry regimes, and cost efficiency. Florida, bound by outdated assumptions, is losing generational continuity in its visitor base. The broader insight is reputational capital. Nationality now dictates not just access, but experience. Where trust and perception erode, mobility collapses, even when legal access remains intact. Florida's misstep reflects this dynamic, showing how perception shifts accelerate structural decline. The risks are already visible. Detentions, secondary screenings, and deportations are increasing across U.S. entry points. For Canadian travelers, small errors, expired documents, mismatched declarations, or algorithmic flags can result in summary removal. Florida, once viewed as low risk, now represents a zone of heightened exposure. Operationally, this introduces chilling effects. Families reconsider annual trips, retirees weigh alternative destinations, and investors diversify away from Florida-based assets. The perception of unpredictability is sufficient to erode inflows, even without formal bans. In mobility intelligence, perception is as decisive as policy. These frictions also reshape capital flows. Canadian property owners in Florida confront legal complexities tied to visa duration, taxation, and healthcare reciprocity. Once routine seasonal stays now risk non-compliance, exposing travelers to penalties. The result is divestment, with capital redirected toward friendlier jurisdictions. For Florida, the consequence is erosion of economic resilience. Tourism revenues shrink, property markets soften, and healthcare systems reliant on seasonal Canadians lose stability. These outcomes, though gradual, reflect cumulative damage that will not reverse under current conditions. The strategic miscalculation was underestimating the fragility of mobility. Small errors at the border, compounded by systemic surveillance, now cascade into macroeconomic consequences. Florida's experience underscores how localized risks tie directly to global travel governance. Future scenarios are clear but divergent. In the short term, mobility restrictions will intensify as states harden borders against geopolitical risk. Canada will prioritize destinations aligned with strategic allies, while Florida remains excluded. The structural gap will widen. Medium-term, digital identity systems will embed risk scoring into all travel decisions. Florida's reliance on federal frameworks ensures continued exposure without the leverage to negotiate exemptions. Canadian flows will stabilize at a lower baseline, never recovering pre-crisis levels. In parallel, alternative markets will capture Florida's lost share. The Caribbean, Mexico, and Southern Europe will absorb Canadian demand, offering stability and predictability. Florida's decline will be contrasted by their rise, illustrating the redistribution of mobility flows. The geopolitical context compounds this outlook. U.S.-Canada relations, strained by domestic politics, limit the likelihood of bilateral agreements restoring past privileges. Florida, positioned at the subnational level, lacks agency to reverse this trajectory. The state's vulnerability is structural, not cyclical. The practical implication is adaptation. Florida must diversify inflows, recalibrate economic models, and acknowledge that dependence on Canadian mobility is unsustainable. Failure to do so will entrench decline, locking the state into a downward spiral. Florida's miscalculation is a case study in mobility intelligence. By underestimating the fragility of cross-border flows, it exposed itself to systemic risk. The collapse of Canadian inflows is not an isolated disruption, but a signal of broader fractures in global travel governance. The lesson is urgent. Mobility is no longer guaranteed, and strategic dependency is now a liability. Stay informed. Stay ahead. Subscribe now and join the conversation below.